Look, the obvious move from Labor was the back in black line, the declaration, of course, at the last budget from the government that this budget would be a back in the black budget, commemorated with a black mug. He was part of that exchange.
On budget night last year, the Prime Minister and the Treasurer released an ad and announced in this chamber that the budget was already back in black, even though it wasn't.
So I was just wondering what marketing will be on the Prime Minister's mug this year.
I won't indulge the juvenile antics of the opposition, Mr. Speaker.
Members on my left.
I won't indulge the juvenile antics. Today is a serious day for Australia.
Wouldn't indulge that, Ash. He did have a few of his own
too juvenile,
lines. Yeah, far too juvenile. Look, by the end of that answer, he was revving right up, talking about Labor's policy to light houses on fire. I mean, we know the Pink Bats was a disastrous program, obviously an unintentional one in terms of the damage it caused. But look, a couple of interesting things I thought out of this. Labor did want to trawl through the history of debt and deficit, and we know the campaign run by Tony Abbott in particular in opposition, talking about the debt and deficit disaster. If you look at the comparative figures now, well, that's all going to get blown out of the water. We know why, and that's COVID-19. So it's an overstretch from Labor to say it's a Morrison-led recession. At the same time, you understand Labor bringing up the history of debt and deficit and campaigns being run in this country, considering how much they were castigated for a much smaller figure on their watch.
Oh, you can only imagine the sort of rhetoric we'd be hearing from a coalition opposition if we were talking about the sort of numbers that we'll be seeing tonight in the budget. I mean, a lot has changed, obviously. That's pretty clear since the GFC days when it comes to that debt and deficit argument. It is fair enough for Australians to start asking, well, just how concerned should we be about the massive debt burden that will be announced tonight? Is it manageable? Because we're looking at figures, $1.1 billion for a debt ceiling, 210 billion or thereabout in terms of the deficit. So these are eye-watering figures. It's hard to wrap your head around those numbers when they are at such a high level. Should we be worried about our ability to pay it off? Well, when you ask economists that question, and you know we both have a lot in recent weeks, they argue, well, not really in the scheme of things. They point out interest rates are at record lows. Just today, as you pointed out, the RBA has kept the cash rate at that very low 0.25% mark. But if Labor had come up with those deficit figures like this, yeah, you can only imagine the response of a coalition opposition at the time that did focus relentlessly on debt and deficit. That argument now has changed a lot in just a few years.
Yeah. Yeah, and not to mention the 1.1 trillion. It's essentially a token debt ceiling now, isn't it? It doesn't need a proper vote. So that is certainly a bygone argument. It seems